The Mahabharata, it's one of the world's oldest and, let's be honest, greatest epics. It's this massive story of gods, heroes, and a war that supposedly changed the entire course of history. But here's the thing. What if the very heart of this myth, the Kurukshetra war, wasn't just a story? What if it was a real historical conflict, and the epic we have today is just the memory of it, passed down through the centuries? All right, so how are we going to tackle a mystery this big? Well, here's the plan. First, we're going to peel back the myth and get to the real historical questions underneath. Then we'll dig into the very human cause of this whole thing. After that, we'll step right onto an Iron Age battlefield, look at the surprisingly strict rules of war they had, and finally, we'll see how the absolutely devastating aftermath is maybe the biggest clue that this was a real and truly tragic event. Okay, so when you first read the Mahabharata, the sheer scale of it is it's mind-boggling. I mean, we're talking about armies with millions of soldiers, these incredible celestial weapons, and literal gods just popping down to intervene in battles. It's so over the top, so epic, that it's really, really easy to just look at it and say, nope, pure fantasy, next. But that's the question, right? The one that's going to drive this whole explainer? Is it really pure myth? Or is it possible that buried deep under all those layers of epic poetry and divine drama, there's an echo, the memory of a real human war? To even begin to answer that, we've got to shift how we think a little. We need to understand how ancient cultures actually remembered and recorded major events. See, it's not about taking the epic literally, word for word. It's about learning how to find the historical truth hidden inside the poetry. And this is a really key idea from the research. Ancient societies often told the story of a war using symbols and epic language, even if the war itself was thought, well, realistically. The myth is like the filter through which the memory passed, not a minute-by-minute news report. So just because the story sounds fantastical, that doesn't automatically mean a real event didn't happen at its core. Right, so if we're going with the idea that a real war happened, then what caused it? I mean, what was it all about? The epic tells a pretty straightforward story. It's a battle of good versus evil, all part of some grand cosmic destiny. But the historical clues point to something way more familiar, and honestly, a lot more tragic. And the most likely cause? A dynastic succession conflict. I mean, come on, this is a story as old as time itself, right? You have a powerful kingdom, but, oops, no clear rules for who gets to be king next. So you get two branches of the same royal family both saying, I'm the rightful heir, and when the talking stops, you get a brutal, devastating civil war. And this comparison right here is so important. On one side, the epic gives us this clean, grand, cosmic battle, good guys versus bad guys. But the historical perspective, it shows us a messy, complicated political conflict. This war wasn't started by the gods. It was started by a political system that was fundamentally broken. And that's because this wasn't some clear-cut case of heroes and villains. You had the Kauravas, the guys in power, trying to hold on to it. And then you had the Pandavas, the challengers, scrambling to build alliances to back up their own claim. The crazy thing is, both sides genuinely believed they were in the right, that Dharma was on their side. And both sides were acting strategically. This kind of moral gray area, that is exactly what a real civil war looks like. Okay, so what did this war actually look like? Let's try to strip away all the epic exaggeration for a second. What can we piece together about the actual armies, the technology, the fighting on the ground? So the epic itself describes this massive, almost modern-style army. Mass conscription, standing armies, complex centralized logistics, the whole shebang. And for historians, that's a huge red flag, because it's completely anachronistic. It just doesn't fit the time period. But the historical reality, that was probably something very, very different. What we're likely looking at is a war fought between coalitions of warrior elites, the Kshatriyas, each leading their own bands of followers. The commanders are up front, fighting from chariots. And the armies aren't one single force. They're patched together from allied groups. I mean, this is a textbook picture of early Iron Age warfare. And the technology itself gives us some of the biggest clues. You see iron weapons, swords, arrowheads. You see horse-drawn chariots. You see leaders fighting personally in the thick of it. All of that fits perfectly into what we know about the period between roughly 1200 and 900 BCE. But what's absent is just as important. There's no mention of siege warfare, no professional infantry corps, no real administrative logistics. It's like a very specific technological fingerprint that points right to the early Iron Age. Even the choice of battlefield, Kurukshetra, makes perfect historical sense. This wasn't just some random field they picked for dramatic effect. No, this was a place with huge symbolic and political authority. To win a battle there, out in the open, was how you proved your sovereignty to everyone. It was a purely strategic move, not just a theatrical one. All right, now this next part, this is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that we're dealing with a real historical memory. And that's the fact that this ancient war actually had rules of engagement. And even more amazing, the epic is brutally honest about how every single one of those rules got broken. Yeah, you heard that right. Rules of war. The Mahabharata actually lays them out. Things like you don't attack an unarmed opponent. The fighting stops at sunset. Warriors of equal rank should fight each other. And you might think that sounds kind of, well, idealistic, right? But it's actually totally consistent with the practical codes of conduct that elite warrior cultures created to try and keep wars from escalating into total society-destroying chaos. But here's the kicker. The epic doesn't just give us a neat little list of rules. It shows us in agonizing detail how they all fall apart, one by one, as the war gets more and more desperate. This exact trajectory, from a shared code of conduct to a slow erosion of the rules and finally to total chaos, that is the classic pattern of a real civil war. It's like the epic accidentally preserved a perfect, historically accurate blueprint for how a state collapses from the inside out. So, what happens after a victory like that? A typical myth would just end there, right? The heroes win, credits roll. But not the Mahabharata. Its ending is long, somber, and deeply tragic. And that, right there, gives us our final, powerful clue to its historical roots. The so-called victory for the Pandavas, it's the classic definition of a Pyrrhic victory. A win that cost you so much, it might as well have been a loss. The epic describes a kingdom that's just hollowed out. There's a massive loss of the elite warrior class. The royal dynasty is effectively extinct. This creates a huge political vacuum. They've inherited territory, sure, but there's no manpower to run it. They have legitimacy, but the institutions are gone. They basically won the keys to an empty, broken house. And this is why the story was remembered so obsessively. Think about it. Cultures celebrate their victories, but they are absolutely haunted by their collapses. The Mahabharata isn't remembered as a story of a glorious win. It's the memory of a deep, collective trauma that marked the end of an entire era. It's a massive cautionary tale about the total failure of a state. I think this quote from our source material just sums it all up perfectly. Myth later magnified its meaning. History supplied its cause. A real, messy, historical civil war, born from political failure, was slowly transformed over centuries into this mythic struggle of cosmic importance. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? It makes you think about that incredibly fine line between history and myth. How many of our other great myths, the foundational stories that shape our cultures, are maybe not just tales of imagination, but actually the echoes of a history that we just can't bear to remember as it truly was?